In 1967, a small incident in the Netherlands would manage to attract the attention of newspapers around the country. Yvonne Paul sets record. Readers could learn the story of Yvonne Paul, a 38-year-old woman who formerly worked as a secretary for the Dutch consulate in New York. Upon being deported from the US after nearly 9 years due to lacking a residency permit and being returned to the Netherlands, Yvonne, being denied any means of returning, would begin living in the passenger lounge of the Schiphol airport in Amsterdam as a protest. The public was surprised to learn that Yvonne had already been living in the airport for 24 days, and the media were quick to proclaim that her protest had set the record for the longest time spent living inside an airport. Though it was surprising for the time, her record was not meant to last. While Yvonne Paul's protest may have ended in failure after nearly 3 months, when she was arrested for refusing to leave, the question of who has lived in an airport for the longest amount of time has remained. How does a person find themselves living in an airport, and how do they manage to last for such a long time? No one attempts to purposely set a record like this, not just because of the difficulty caused by its length, but because the authorities in many countries are likely to remove someone once they're noticed. Aditya Singh managed to stay 89 days at the O'Hare International Airport in Chicago after missing his return flight to Los Angeles. He was only discovered when he was asked for his identification in a restricted part of the airport, and he produced the stolen badge of an operations manager, leading to his arrest. If Singh was never discovered, it's likely that his case would never have been documented, as is the case with many homeless individuals who live at airports. A 1986 article from the Chicago Tribune describes a man by the name of Fred Dilsner, a former accountant who claims he had been living at the O'Hare Airport for just over a year. And according to Dilsner, there were likely 30 to 50 other people going unnoticed at the airport at any one time, with as many as 200 hiding away during the winter. For many of these individuals, the airport is more of a temporary shelter to stay for the night or during bad weather, rather than a permanent residence. Unlike Yvonne or Singh, these people are often regularly coming and going for various reasons. Someone like Anthony Delaney may be credited for spending 3 years living in the Gatwick airport, but he was also regularly removed, being arrested over 30 times for trespassing and theft. While some of the longest recorded cases are from people who live in the airport voluntarily, the vast majority of recorded cases come from people who find themselves unable to go beyond the airport's exit. There can be a variety of reasons why someone may find themselves trapped. For Ahmed Kanan, he would have to stay in the Kuala Lumpur International Airport for 53 days. He claims Turkish authorities took his passport and deported him to his previous destination of Malaysia after learning he was from Syria. Edward Snowden would spend 39 days in the Sheremetyevo Airport in Russia, after he had fled the United States for leaking information regarding government surveillance programs. Others recently, such as Roman Trofimov, were trapped for 110 days at the Ninoy Aquino International Airport in the Philippines due to coronavirus travel restrictions. Renee Sake and Timothy Berrien both had to stay at the same airport as Trofimov years earlier for 5 months, when the Bureau of Immigration refused to grant them entry into the Philippines, and the airline responsible for sending them back continued to delay and cite problems with their documents. Meanwhile, Feng Zhenghu would have no problems with his papers. The Chinese government just didn't want him back after a trip to Japan due to his activism and criticism of the government, only managing to make it back into the country from a flight to Shanghai after spending 86 days in the Narita International Airport in Japan. As can be seen, there is no singular reason that can result in someone living in an airport, and the time a person may end up staying widely varies. However, we're going to be looking at 2 categories of people. What is the longest case of a person who has lived in the airport voluntarily while having the ability to leave at any time, like Yvonne Paul, and who has been forced to live in an airport the longest without having the option of easily leaving? But before that, let's look at our second question from earlier. How does a person manage to last for months without leaving an airport? Many basic necessities such as shelter and water may be provided for free. But what about food, clothing, and other items related to personal hygiene? Airports in many countries are not known for being cheap, and while such items are often available, the people who find themselves in these situations often have very little with them, or may have had their items confiscated by security. Even people involved in some of the shortest cases have found they don't have enough money or support to ensure a comfortable stay. This frequently results in individuals having the option of either begging, being taken care of by airport staff, or some combination of the two. Neither of these options guarantees a more comfortable stay. Ahmed Khanan had to resort to begging, only to tell reporters that he would often only eat one meal per day and that he had lost over 20 pounds by the time he was allowed to leave. Meanwhile, Mohammed al-Bahish was provided food, a bed, and even allowed to use the showers for employees in the luggage department of the Almaty International Airport in Kazakhstan. But this would come at the cost of being required to live in a small windowless room in the transit area under constant surveillance with limited outside contact for 150 days. Others receiving free meals from the airport would often find their health declining from a prolonged diet of pre-made airline meals, while some may find themselves dealing with other physical ailments caused by stress or from having to sleep on benches every night for months. Hygiene proved to be another frequent challenge. If a person was lucky, they might find someone willing to take their clothes out for cleaning, but the majority appear to have needed to utilize sinks in the bathroom. Donations that may have been spent on better food would instead have to be used on items such as soap, toothpaste, or even a new set of clean clothes. A person may even have the money to afford such items, but because they're restricted to a specific terminal or other area, they may not be able to acquire their money from an ATM. Regardless of whether a person found themselves staying for only a few weeks, a few months, or even a few years, nearly all of them would encounter one of these problems at some point during their stay. With this cleared up, let's move on to our first category. After Yvonne Paul, who would set the record for the longest recorded time living in an airport voluntarily? It would take nearly 20 years for another well-documented case to become known of, and while no one knew it at the time, the length of his stay would capture even more worldwide attention than Yvonne. On August 26, 1988, Mehran Karimi Nassiri would enter the Charles de Gaulle Airport in France. No one could guess it at the time, but it would be many years before he would leave. After being discovered without a passport upon arriving in London, Nassiri would tell immigration officials that he was traveling to the United Kingdom to be with his biological mother, who was a nurse currently living in Scotland. He had been expelled from his home country of Iran for participating in protests against the Shah, and now he had nowhere else to go. His documents had reportedly been stolen in transit, preventing him from entering the United Kingdom, but due to his expulsion, they also couldn't return him to Iran. After being questioned, the decision was made instead to return him to Paris until a solution to his dilemma could be found. It wouldn't take long for word to spread of the man who was now living in Charles de Gaulle Airport, resulting in Nassiri obtaining a celebrity status as he befriended airport employees and other travelers who sought to offer him support in the form of food, money, or other items to care for himself. Nassiri would become a regular part of the airport life, often eating at McDonald's, rolling his own cigarettes, reading books and newspapers given to him by employees, and for some time, he'd even receive letters from around the world. While he would have to utilize the public bathrooms for most of his personal hygiene-related needs, the Charles de Gaulle Airport does offer access to showers in some of the lounge areas that it appears Nassiri may have been able to use. He would even receive assistance from employees in having his clothes taken out for cleaning occasionally. This would be Nassiri's life for the foreseeable future. While French human rights lawyer Christian Bourget would take on Nassiri's case to win him his freedom, something had begun to change about Nassiri, and that would cause Bourget a significant problem. If you've never heard the story of Mehran Nassiri, then perhaps there's a chance you've heard of him by his other name, Sir Alfred Mehran. It continues to be speculated as to why Nassiri did this, but at some point during his stay, he would begin to form a new identity for himself. No longer identifying as Mehran Nassiri from Iran, he now viewed himself as Sir Alfred Mehran of Britain. An investigation performed by his lawyer to find what happened to his missing papers eventually provided results, when it was discovered Nassiri's papers had not been stolen, but were mailed to Brussels in Belgium by Nassiri for unknown reasons. When his lawyer obtained these documents and attempted to return them to Nassiri, Nassiri would refuse to accept the papers, claiming they weren't using his proper name and listed the wrong country of origin. This would not be the only oddity that would arise about Nassiri. Investigations into his story of being expelled from Iran eventually revealed that while he had partaken in protests, he had never been expelled from the country over them. Furthermore, his story about having a mother living in Scotland didn't appear to be true either, as while Nassiri had initially told reporters he was informed of his biological mother's existence by his mother in Iran, his family that was found to still be living in Iran claimed this information from Nassiri was false. Despite the mounting pile of evidence against nearly every part of Nassiri's original story, he would continue to stand by his claims. In his mind, he was Sir Alfred Mehran, a man that was unwilling to accept the idea that he was not who he claimed he was, and if living inside the airport would mean he could continue the life he wanted, then he appeared to be happy enough remaining where he was. While it had taken many years, for the majority of Nassiri's stay in the airport, he did have the freedom to obtain proper documents and leave. He had money from donations, had sold the rights to his story to DreamWorks, served as inspiration for numerous movies and documentaries such as The Terminal, and had even written his own autobiography. He had everything he would need to start a new life, except the will to move on. Nassiri would choose to continue this simple lifestyle, nearly always being found sitting on his red bench in the passenger lounge, only finally leaving in 2006 after becoming sick with an undisclosed illness and being moved to a nearby hospital. Ever since then, he has reportedly been living quietly in a parish shelter with no mention as to whether he has adjusted to the outside world. With a total time of nearly 18 years, Nassiri is often considered by many to have lived the longest in an airport due to his notoriety. While a few of those years may have been involuntary until Nassiri's lawyer found his papers, by that point, Nassiri had already assumed the identity of Sir Alfred. Perhaps it wasn't his initial intention to stay, as he did make one attempt to leave during his first year once he had saved enough to buy another plane ticket, but he was again denied entry to London. In the years following this failure, it appears Nassiri began to accept the idea of the airport being his one and only home. While Nassiri was spending his time living in the Charles de Gaulle airport, another young man began his even longer stay across the world in Brazil. Sometime in the year 2000, Denis Luiz de Souza would leave his home at only 16 years old due to fighting with his stepmother, eventually making his way to the Sao Paulo Guarulhos International Airport to find a new place to stay. It wouldn't take long for staff to notice de Souza sleeping on a bench and never leaving the airport, but rather than remove him, they would instead provide him with assistance. He'd receive regular meals, clothing, blankets, and other necessities he might need, all coming from the staff, and quickly he'd become a regular part of the airport, as he spent his time wandering the airport's terminals, interacting with workers and travelers, and offering assistance to anyone that needed it. Even upon turning 18, de Souza would continue his life that he had started for himself here, and in interviews with staff members about de Souza, many of them expressed concerns about what would happen to him if he was forced to leave. It's believed de Souza may have a variety of psychological disabilities, impacting his memory and learning capabilities, leaving him unable to effectively provide for himself. It's said that he frequently speaks in incomplete sentences or has a difficult time understanding complex concepts and other occurrences outside the airport. While de Souza has said he'd one day love to own his own home, he still appears to be content with his life in Terminal 2 of the airport, and so long as he respects the airport's rules, it appears he will be allowed to stay. And for almost 22 years, this is where de Souza currently lives. Unlike Nassiri, de Souza does occasionally leave the airport for brief periods of time. He has reportedly gone to visit his family during these 22 years, always returning a short time later, and it appears he is sometimes brought to someone's house to take a shower if he is unable to take one at the airport. De Souza has also stated in an interview that a security commander pays for a hotel room for him every Christmas, so that he can sleep on a proper bed and take a proper shower. De Souza's time at the airport may have surpassed that of Nassiri, but de Souza would never hold the record for living in an airport the longest, as before de Souza began his stay, and only 3 years after Nassiri began his, a man in Turkey by the name of Bayram Tepeli would live in the Ataturk airport for longer than anyone else. In 1991, Tepeli would also leave his home at 26 years old due to problems with his family, leading to him taking up a position with a cleaning company to provide for himself. Initially staying at a hotel, upon learning that he was lacking proper accommodations, his boss would have him assigned to the Ataturk airport where he could stay for free, and have access to everything else he would need. He would resort to sleeping on benches and using the airport's various facilities to take care of himself, and unlike many others, it appears that due to having a job, he didn't need to resort to begging or relying heavily on handouts. This would change, however, at some point during the late 2000s, when Tepeli would have to quit his job due to atherosclerosis in his left leg, a disease that results in clogged arteries causing pain and risk of blood clots, along with other medical ailments in his feet preventing him from performing his work. Rather than leave the airport, he would make the decision to keep living there, continuing many of the activities he had done before to pass the time, such as interacting with shopkeepers he had befriended as he was now relying on them for support, wandering the airport, resting, or going out to walk around the city if the weather was nice. Every week, he would travel to a nearby public bathhouse for an opportunity to take a shower, as Tepeli has described himself as someone who hates being dirty, ensuring that he doesn't leave any trash behind, and even wiping down any benches he intends to sleep on before laying down. For Tepeli, the airport is considered his home, and the shopkeepers and other people he interacts with daily his family. The only times he has left the airport for an extended period of time have been when he was seeking medical treatment for his legs, along with the few times he has gone to stay with the family he fled from. But this life that Tepeli had built for himself in the Ataturk airport would come to an end in 2019, when the Ataturk airport became closed to commercial passenger travel. Now only supporting general aviation and cargo, many of the shops would be forced to close down, and after just over 27 years, Tepeli would be forced to leave. Once again, he would have to decide on a new place of residence, and just like before, Tepeli would choose to live in an airport. Making a 50-kilometer journey, Tepeli would relocate himself to the Sabiha Gökçen airport, where he has reportedly been living ever since, bringing his total combined time to nearly 30 years, making him one of the longest known cases of a person living in an airport. Each of these men were fortunate enough to find somewhere that they could not only receive support, but were allowed to stay without being hidden. While success often comes down to the country and airport, there are a few other long-lasting cases. Sanjay Shah managed to stay in the Nairobi airport for just over 400 days, after he had renounced his Kenyan citizenship and before his British citizenship application was approved. Officials informed him that he could leave the airport while waiting, but he chose to remain both as a protest and out of fear that his case would be forgotten or ignored. Besides just D'Souza and Tepeli, one other man has currently been living in an airport for more than 10 years. Hui Jiangwa moved into the Beijing Capital International Airport back in 2008, after he had lost his job and was told by his wife that he wasn't allowed to drink in their home anymore. In response, Hui would grab his belongings and move into the airport, as in his words, "It's a public place, everyone can come here." Unlike nearly everyone else who lives in an airport, it appears Hui doesn't actually rely on handouts or support from the staff. Some airport workers have even recalled getting into confrontations with Hui whenever he drinks too much and begins to disturb passengers. Instead, Hui receives a monthly government subsidy for being unemployed of 1,000 yuan, or about 150 USD. He uses this money to purchase food and alcohol, while telling others that the prices in the airport aren't any higher than the rest of the city. For anything else that he needs, he says that he just goes to his old home and takes it. He has the freedom to return at any time, but as the demand from his wife still stands years later, he continues to spend his days living in the airport. The lives that these people have created for themselves may appear to be comfortable enough, but what about people who have to stay in an airport against their will? Besides Nasiri, who appeared to have quickly made the decision to live in the airport regardless of whether he could go free, what sort of conditions have others had to experience, and what's the longest other people have had to wait for their freedom? One of the earliest documented cases once again appears to be one of the longest. Zara Kamalfar and her 2 children would flee Iran using falsified Bulgarian passports, after Zara's husband was executed for his activism against the Iranian government. Initially fleeing to Turkey, followed by Russia and Germany, German officials would be the ones to notice the family was using fake documents, resulting in their return to Russia where they would apply for refugee status. kept together in a hotel at the Sheremetyevo International Airport, the family was evicted from their room a short time later, when they were informed they would actually need to pay, leaving them on their own to live in the public area of the airport. While one of the state airliners reportedly regularly donated meals to the family, and they would receive occasional donations from travelers for other necessities, the stress of constantly being threatened with deportation, as officials questioned the family's escape story, along with poor hygiene and a diet consisting of airline food, would result in numerous health problems that only became more frequent over time. It wouldn't be until March 15, 2007 that they would all finally be granted asylum in Canada, where they would reunite with Zara's brother. For 10 months, the family had been forced to call the airport their home, citing one of the longest known waiting times in recent history. Just like Nasiri, the bar set by one of the earliest cases would prove to be one of the longest. Numerous other cases would occur over the years, but it wasn't until the refugee crisis in the years following the Arab Spring that cases would become more common. Fadi Mansur may have been one of the longest stays that occurred at this time. Fleeing from Syria, he initially traveled to Lebanon and Turkey, followed by Malaysia with the intention of continuing to Europe. But upon arriving in Malaysia, he was sent back to the Ataturk airport in Turkey. He would reportedly have to spend his time in the problematic passenger room, a small room currently packed with other refugees beyond its designed capacity. While many of his needs were provided for, the confinement would take its toll on him mentally, with Mansour even questioning if returning to Syria would be preferable to staying in the room. Furthermore, he would be hospitalized nearly 8 months into his wait after being attacked by another detainee. His request to be sent back to his previous destination of Lebanon was approved after this incident, but upon arriving in Lebanon, he was returned to Turkey, where he would once again find himself in the problematic passenger room. For over a year in total, he had been forced to live in this room, until finally he was allowed to leave and be relocated to a repatriation center. Following this, many other individuals would find themselves trapped in airports in the following years, but these cases would be solved in less time than Mansour. In 2018, Liu Xinglian and Yang Ke-fen would stay for 125 days at the Taoyuan International Airport after fleeing China, until they were finally granted entry to Taiwan and later granted asylum by Canada. Just after these two men became trapped, Hassan Alcantar would finally end his 208-day stay at the Kuala Lumpur International Airport, after he had fled Syria for refusing to join the military during the Civil War. Hassan would manage to bring a significant amount of media attention to his case when he began to upload regular updates about his life. 2 more cases from around the same time would come close to taking the record. The Lulendo family would live in the Incheon airport in South Korea after applying for asylum when they had fled Angola due to persecution against them being Congolese. It would take 9 months of waiting in the transit lounge and enduring multiple attempts to repatriate the family before they were finally granted asylum and allowed to enter the country. Isa Muhammad would have to stay in the Addis Ababa International Airport after being deported from Israel and being denied entry to his home country of Niger. Ethiopian authorities appeared to be uncertain of how to assist Isa, since he wasn't trying to actually enter Ethiopia, but they couldn't find another country willing to take him. While specific details about how he managed to be released appear to be unknown, it seems that he was finally able to be released after approximately 300 days, reporting on his Twitter that he was in Mali, before making another update sometime later stating he was starting a new life in Senegal. There was, however, one more case beginning just a few months into Isa's confinement that would far surpass the year of waiting endured by Mansour. The case of Arlen Hada is perhaps one of the most complex due to its uniqueness. Arlen and his family were originally from Kyrgyzstan, which was at the time a part of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union finally broke apart, Arlen's family claims that they were denied citizenship and subsequently left stateless by Kyrgyz authorities. Eventually managing to obtain fake passports, the family would travel to Norway, where it appears that years later, Arlen's mother, brother, and sister would all receive residency, but Arlen's application would be denied. When Norwegian officials eventually decided to act in 2016, they would initially deport Arlen, his wife, and their child to Kyrgyzstan, but a short time later, both his wife and child were allowed to return without him. Immigration officials initially refused to believe that he had spent nearly his entire life as a stateless individual, but when no evidence could be found tracing Arlen to being a citizen of Kyrgyzstan, both countries began trying to determine where he should go. Arlen would remain in Kyrgyzstan for another 2 years, although it remains unknown if he was confined to the airport during this time. It looked like he would be free in 2019 when he managed to obtain a visa to enter Russia, but upon arriving in Moscow, Arlen would quickly be returned to Kyrgyzstan after it was discovered his visa and passport were fake. From here, starting on January 19, 2019, for the next 628 days, Arlen would find himself trapped in the Manas International Airport, spending his time waiting in an airport lounge and keeping in regular contact with his family who were still trying to help him in Norway. The struggle of supporting himself and finding enough food was only made more difficult just over a year into his stay, when large sections of the airport became closed due to the coronavirus, leading to Arlen suffering from malnutrition. Furthering his problems, his asylum application to Norway was initially rejected in March of 2020. Norwegian authorities appeared to be pushing for Arlen to try to legalize his stay in Kyrgyzstan rather than attempting to return to Norway, but Arlen was afraid that entrance to Kyrgyzstan would result in his arrest over the fake visa. It wouldn't be until October 8th of that year that Norwegian officials finally relented and reversed their previous decision, finally granting Arlen temporary residence and allowing him to return to Norway. If recent history has proven anything, it's that nearly anyone can find themselves trapped in an airport for a variety of reasons. Even during the making of this video, a man named Deo Hasabumutima has been living in the Istanbul airport for over 7 months, over an expired passport he can't renew due to being a refugee. Meanwhile, while Roman Trofimov may have been reported on for how long he had stayed in a Filipino airport due to his problems with his passport and coronavirus travel restrictions, it's noted in some articles that other unnamed individuals were also forced to live there for various amounts of time. While the rise of social media has allowed trapped individuals a means of informing others of their situation, it's likely that hundreds, if not thousands of other people over the years have found themselves living in an airport without receiving any attention. The possibility then remains open that someone, somewhere, either willingly or unwillingly, has been living in an airport for longer than Arlen or Tepeli, all without the rest of the world noticing. Depending on how long it takes airport authorities to deal with a case, you never know who will stay for only a week and who might become the next Mehran Nasiri.